But my grandfather told me that concentration camps were special camps set up for the enemies of Germany. People who were inimical to the regime, people who had committed some political or other crimes. And among them, he said, are also Jews. And I said, well, why Jews? And he said, well, because Jews are the enemies of the German people. And clearly in time of war, you don't let your enemies run around and do damage to you. You lock them up. You confine them in one place. And that is how I learned about this concentration camp and about the Jews. And I said, well, what do people do in these concentration camps? And he said, well, they're put to work. And one example was that, as I said, the clearing up of the rubble. And that was the extent of my knowledge about concentration camps until the end of the war. And there was one other episode that I remember, and that is when, again, I must have been about 11 years old. And because going from Potsdam, from the school to my grandfather's house in the north of Berlin, Potsdam is also on the outskirts of Berlin, but in the southwestern area. And so one had to change trains several times on the subway and the local trains. And so rather than make the trip by myself, my grandmother came and picked me up and took me back to Oranienburg for, I think it was a brief vacation. And we were entering one compartment in the train. German trains, as you know, are different, or European trains are different from American trains. You generally have an aisle on one side of the car, and then you have compartments going off from that. So we were looking for a compartment with as few people in it as possible, as one is apt to do, and finally found one with only one man sitting in the corner. And as we entered, he got up in order to leave. And my grandmother motioned him and said, you know, stay where you are, you don't have to leave. And then I observed that he wore a Star of David on his clothing. It didn't mean anything to me. And we finished the journey, and ultimately he got up and left. He apparently had reached his destination, and we went on. And my question was, well, why was he getting up? What was he doing? And she said, well, he is a Jew. And Jews are forced or are obliged to leave a compartment when an Aryan, when a Gentile enters. And I simply recorded this. It didn't mean anything to me. I didn't feel any outrage of this. As a child of 11, you take this thing and you absorb it as a piece of information, but it didn't mean anything. None of this really meant anything in the sense of having that I thought about it or said, my God, what are we doing? No, it never occurred to me. It was not until the end of the war that I became confronted with what Nazi Germany had been and what it had done. And I remember that shortly after the Russians had marched into Potsdam, Potsdam was occupied by the Russians, and as was Berlin, everything had broken down, no electricity, no transportation, no gas, no newspapers. And so it was a few days before we could find out what was going on by having at the corners the city government or the Russians established reading plaques, wooden boards, to which were pasted newspaper articles or newspapers. And there was no home delivery, there were no newspapers in it. These were just very brief notices about what was going on in the world and what had happened to Germany. And I remember seeing a headline that said, Germans killed 4 million Jews. By this time I was a little bit older than 10 or 11 and 12, and I was outraged. I said, how is this possible? And I was convinced at first that that kind of accusation was similar to the accusations which had been made against the Germans during the First World War and after the First World War, when Germans also had been accused of various crimes, of chopping off nuns, raping nuns in Belgium, or chopping off children's and babies' hands, and so on. And most of which, of course, later on was proven to be totally untrue. It was just useful propaganda used by the British and also by the Americans. And I was convinced that what I saw here was simply a replay of that. Germany was being set up to be the guilty person, God knows what I thought we were expected to do, probably pay reparations again in order to atone for our quote-unquote sins. And I simply did not believe what I read. Then, after a while, the figures changed, and then it was not only 4 million people, it was 5 million Jews, and ultimately it was 6 million. I still did not believe it. On one occasion, I went to an almanac. I said, you know, we didn't even have that many Jews in Germany. And discovered to my great joy, yes, indeed, we didn't. Germany only had about 600,000 Jews. So how could we possibly have killed 6 million of them? Until I looked at the areas which Germany had covered, had occupied during that period from 1939 to 1945, and looked at their Jewish populations in France and Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Austria, which of course became part of Germany in 1938, but particularly Poland and Russia. And then I realized that, yes, the numbers were there, the numbers fit. It was possible for the Germans to have done this. I still did not believe it. To me, it was inconceivable that we as Germans, as people who were brought up decently, with the idea of treating others decently and justly, could have done that. It was just inconceivable and unacceptable. I think that my mind did not begin to change slowly, and it was a process which was painful and which took place over a period of about 2 years, between 1945 and 1947. The first thing that made me change my mind or accept what had happened was that an exhibit had come to Bremen, where we had moved from Potsdam. We had left Potsdam late in 1945, after I had been put in prison by the Russians twice for having been a member of that Nazi school, and so they thought I was a big Nazi. And even though I was able to convince them that at the age of 14 or 15 there was really not much I could have done in any circumstances, finally, after the second time when I got out of jail, my mother and my brother and I and my grandmother decided that we would leave Potsdam and would go west, and we did, and ended up in Bremen. Well, in Bremen, it must have been 1946 maybe, there was an exhibit, a traveling exhibit, which had been put together, and it consisted of artifacts from the various concentration camps.
How old were you?
By that time I was 16, 17. Then, of course, there was the Nuremberg trial, and I began to listen to it on radio. I had a little headset with a crystal detector. That was the only thing that was available in those years. And so I would listen to it, and I would read the reports about the Nuremberg trial. And of course, again, this was secondhand. But then we saw newsreels of the concentration camps, of what the Germans had done, not only in Germany, but also at the extermination camps in Poland. I began to learn the difference between the camps in Germany and the camps in Poland. And then I met an American teacher who was attached to one of the American schools, a high school teacher, to one of the American dependent schools, which had been set up by the American government for the American personnel. And we had long discussions about Hitler and about politics and about democracy and so on. And again, here at first, I was a defender of Hitler and of Germany, and felt that Germany had been much maligned and had been aggrieved, and injustices had been committed. Until again, finally, he happened to be a historian. In our long discussions, once again, eventually, I began to see a different picture. And as I said, it took me 2-3 years before I fully accepted what Germans had done.